bikers threaten Clint Eastwood, unaware that he holds a black belt in karate. But before we dive into the story, be sure to hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. A roadside diner sat at the edge of a long, desolate highway, surrounded by an expanse of barren land and towering sun-scorched cacti. Its faded neon sign flickered inconsistently, casting a dim, wavering glow as the late afternoon light began to fade. Inside, the air was thick with the aroma of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee. Regular customers filled the booths, their conversations blending into a low, familiar hum. A waitress dressed in a checkered apron weaved effortlessly between tables, balancing plates of burgers and fries with the ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. It was the kind of place where things stayed quiet, predictable, until Clint Eastwood stepped inside. The door creaked open, allowing a gust of warm Texas air to sweep through the room, carrying with it a man who, at first glance, seemed both out of place and perfectly at home. His tall, broad-shouldered frame commanded attention, his presence speaking of a life filled with untold stories. His weathered face, lined with deep creases, hinted at countless battles. Some fought with fists, others with sheer resilience. He wore a well-worn leather jacket, its aged material a testament to the years it had endured, and a hat that cast a shadow over his sharp, piercing eyes. As Clint stepped inside, the murmur of conversation waned, every head subtly turning in his direction. A mix of curiosity and unease rippled through the diner. Without hurry, he scanned the room, his expression unreadable, before making his way to an empty booth near the window. His movements were slow, deliberate, the kind of composure that spoke of someone who never rushed, who calculated every step. Sliding into the seat, he nodded at the approaching waitress. "Black coffee, scrambled eggs," he said in a voice that was low, roughened by time. Betty, the waitress, smiled warmly. "Coming right up, hun." Across the room, a burst of laughter interrupted the moment. A rowdy group of bikers sprawled across two adjacent booths, their presence dominating the space. Their leather vests, adorned with skull and flame patches, marked them as members of the Iron Serpent Motorcycle Club. Their leader, a burly, thick-armed man named Duke, held court at the center, his brash voice carrying an unmistakable air of menace. He cracked crude jokes, his gang erupting in raucous laughter, the kind that made others wary. Duke's gaze landed on Clint, and a sly grin spread across his face. "Well, well, looks like we got ourselves a cowboy," he announced loudly, making sure the whole diner heard. His crew chuckled, their eyes flicking between Duke and Clint, waiting for a reaction. But Clint didn't flinch. He took a measured sip of his coffee, his gaze fixed on the dusty road outside, as if Duke didn't exist. Bikers weren't used to being ignored, and Duke wasn't the type to let it slide. "Hey, Grandpa," Duke called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "You lose your horse on the way here?" More laughter erupted. Still Clint remained silent, his stoic expression betraying nothing. The atmosphere in the diner shifted. Other patrons tensed, sensing trouble. Betty, always the peacemaker, shot Duke a warning look, but he merely shrugged her off. Clint set his coffee cup down, the soft clink of ceramic echoing in the quieting room. Slowly he turned his head, his piercing gaze locking onto Duke. The air felt heavier, thick with unspoken tension. "Mind your business," Clint said, his voice calm, carrying the weight of quiet authority. Duke's smirk faltered for just a second before he scoffed. "Oh, we got ourselves a tough guy," he said, feigning amusement. "What you gonna do, old man?" The room was a powder keg, waiting for a spark. Clint remained composed, taking another sip of coffee, but the message was clear. This wasn't over. The silence that followed was almost suffocating. Clint stayed put, his focus seemingly on the steam rising from his cup, but his stillness only antagonized Duke further. The rest of the diner pretended to mind their own business, but all eyes were locked on the confrontation unfolding before them. Duke, fueled by the goading of his crew, leaned forward in his seat. "Hey, cowboy," he called again, louder now. "You deaf or just too old to hear me?" His gang chuckled, one of them, a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek, muttering something that set off another round of laughter. Clint remained unmoved. Duke rose from his seat, boots thudding against the floor as he sauntered toward Clint's booth. The other bikers leaned forward, their expressions hungry for entertainment. Stopping at the table, Duke loomed over Clint, his shadow stretching across the table. "I'm talking to you, old man," Duke said, his voice laced with amusement and challenge. Clint didn't look up. Duke smirked, leaning against the table just enough to jostle it. Clint's coffee cup tipped, the dark liquid spilling across the surface, pooling near his hand before dripping onto the floor. "Whoops," Duke sneered. "Clumsy me. Guess you're too slow to grab it in time." The laughter stopped. Even Duke's gang fell silent, watching intently. The air felt different now, charged with something unspoken. Other patrons stiffened, unease creeping in. Betty stood frozen behind the counter, her grip tightening on its edge. Clint calmly set his cup back on its saucer. Reaching for a napkin, he began to wipe the mess with an unnerving patience. Duke, expecting an outburst, scowled at Clint's lack of reaction. "What's the matter, old-timer?" Duke taunted, leaning in, his breath heavy with whiskey and cigarettes. "Cat got your tongue? Maybe I should teach you some manners, show you what happens when you don't respect your betters." Finally, Clint looked up. His piercing stare met Duke's, the weight of it enough to make even a man like Duke hesitate. No fear, no anger, just an unwavering, quiet intensity that spoke volumes. "You should clean that up," Clint said, his voice calm and steady, less a suggestion, more an order. Duke blinked, momentarily caught off guard, then let out a bark of laughter. He turned to his gang, grinning. "You hear that? He wants me to clean it up. Ain't that rich?" The others laughed, but there was hesitation in their amusement. Something about Clint's demeanor was unsettling. Duke turned back to Clint, his smirk fading. "You got a lot of nerve, old man," he muttered, voice lowering to a growl. "Maybe I should knock some sense into you." He cracked his knuckles. "Clint didn't move." "Oh, you don't want to do that," Clint said, his voice carrying a quiet warning. Duke straightened, fists clenched at his sides, his pride forcing him forward. The room braced for what was coming, but Clint had already seen it all before. And he was ready. The gang's laughter died down as they caught sight of Clint's expression. It wasn't just unafraid, it was calculating, almost predatory. A flicker of hesitation flashed across Duke's face, his instincts warning him that he was making a mistake. But pride was a stubborn thing, and Duke's ego refused to let him back down. With a growl, he clenched his fists, the muscles in his arms tightening as he prepared to strike. The diner seemed frozen in time, every eye locked onto the unfolding standoff. Though Duke was the clear aggressor, everyone in the room felt the same unshakable truth. This fight was not going to go the way he thought. Clint squared his shoulders, taking a deep breath. He had encountered men like Duke before, loud, brash, overconfident, and every single time they had learned the hard way that appearances could be deceiving. The tension thickened, a silent pressure filling the air. Then Clint's voice, steady and firm, sliced through it like a blade. "Your move, kid." Duke loomed over Clint, fists clenched at his sides, veins bulging along his forearms. His gang, still seated but leaning forward now, were eager for what they believed would be a swift and brutal display of dominance. The other diners sat stiffly in their booths, caught between fear and morbid curiosity. No one dared to move. Even Betty, who had seen her fair share of bar fights, remained motionless behind the counter, her lips pressed into a thin, worried line. With a roar more for show than anything else, Duke finally threw his punch, aiming straight for Clint's jaw. He wanted this over in one hit, but the hit never landed. In a flash of movement, Clint shifted effortlessly to the side, dodging the blow with a precision that felt almost rehearsed. Duke's fist sailed past empty air, his momentum throwing him slightly off balance. Before he could recover, Clint's hand shot out, locking around Duke's wrist in a grip like iron. A collective gasp rippled through the diner. Clint's grip was unyielding, his fingers pressing into the soft flesh of Duke's wrist with just the right amount of pressure. Duke let out a strangled grunt, his body instinctively recoiling from the pain. In one swift motion, Clint twisted Duke's arm, forcing him forward and onto one knee. The hard impact of Duke's knee striking the tiled floor echoed in the heavy silence of the room. "First rule," Clint said evenly, his voice carrying a hint of instruction. "Don't telegraph your punches." Duke's face contorted with pain and humiliation. He struggled, but Clint's grip didn't waver. The gang jolted into action, jumped to their feet, their chairs scraping violently against the floor. "Let him go, old man," one of them barked, pulling a switchblade from his pocket. The blade caught the dim glow of the flickering neon lights, reflecting a menacing glint. Gasps filled the room. Betty instinctively ducked behind the counter, her trembling hands fumbling for the phone. Clint, unfazed, remained where he was. In one seamless motion, he released Duke's wrist and, using the same hand, drove his elbow straight into Duke's face. A sickening crack rang through the air as Duke tumbled backward, clutching his nose as blood trickled between his fingers. Clint barely gave him a second glance as he turned his attention to the advancing gang. His posture was relaxed but alert, like a coiled spring ready to snap. The first biker lunged at him, knife in hand, moving fast but without precision. Clint sidestepped with ease, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it sharply. The knife clattered to the floor. With the same fluid motion, Clint delivered a swift knee to the biker's stomach, sending him doubling over and gasping for air. "Second rule," Clint murmured as the biker crumpled to the ground. "Don't bring a knife to a fight you don't know how to finish." The remaining bikers hesitated, their confidence wavering. The man they had assumed was just an old drifter had just taken down two of their own in mere seconds. But adrenaline and wounded pride were powerful motivators. Two more charged him at once, hoping that sheer numbers would be their advantage. Clint moved like a shadow, ducking under their wild swings and countering with a spinning kick. His boot connected with one biker's chest, sending him flying backward into a table, plates and glasses shattering on impact. The second attacker lunged from behind, arms outstretched to grab him, but Clint met him with a sharp elbow to the ribs. The biker staggered, winded, and before he could recover, Clint delivered a precise strike to the back of his knee, dropping him to the floor. The diner was now in chaos. Tables had been overturned, chairs knocked aside. Coffee and broken glass littered the floor. The once lively murmur of conversation had been replaced by stunned silence. Duke, still dazed and bleeding, scrambled to his feet. Fury and disbelief twisted his face. "Get him!" he bellowed, his voice thick with rage. "Take him down!" Two of the remaining bikers exchanged uncertain glances. One of them, a wiry man with a web of tattoos snaking up his neck, hesitated. "This ain't worth it, man," he muttered, taking a step back. His companion, a heavy-set man with a shaved head, looked equally unsure. Clint met their gaze, his expression unreadable. "You want to end up like the others?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. "Be my guest." A tense silence stretched between them. Then, as if reaching the same unspoken conclusion, they both bolted for the door, their boots thudding against the floor. Duke, realizing he was outnumbered and outmatched, stumbled backward. His bravado had crumbled. With shaking hands, he pointed a bloody finger at Clint. "You're gonna regret this, old man," he spat, his voice laced with empty threats. "You don't know who you're messing with." Clint took a single step forward. Duke flinched. "Walk away," Clint said, his tone firm and final, "before you embarrass yourself any more than you already have." For a brief moment it seemed like Duke might try one last act of defiance, but the realization hit him. He had already lost. Muttering a string of curses under his breath, he staggered toward the door, pressing his sleeve against his bleeding nose. As the door slammed shut behind him, the diner fell into an eerie silence. Betty slowly emerged from behind the counter, her wide eyes fixed on Clint. Are you okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Clint adjusted his jacket and reached for his hat. "I'm fine," he said simply, as if the chaos surrounding him was nothing more than an everyday occurrence. He turned to the stunned patrons, all of whom were staring at him with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Sorry for the mess," he added, and with that he walked out the door, leaving the diner and everyone in it stunned into silence. The biker took a direct hit to the jaw, his head snapping sideways before his body crumpled to the ground with a heavy thud. A chorus of gasps and astonished murmurs erupted throughout the diner. Some of the patrons who had initially remained frozen in fear now whispered in awe. Others, emboldened by Clint's display of skill, let out quiet cheers. "He's like something straight out of an action movie," one man muttered in disbelief. Behind the counter, Betty still clutched the phone, shaking her head in amazement. "I don't know who he is," she murmured to herself, "but he sure isn't just some retiree." At this point, only one biker remained standing. He was younger than the others, lean, jittery, his wiry frame coiled with nervous energy. His unpredictability made him dangerous. With a menacing sneer, he pulled a heavy chain from his pocket, the metal links clanking as he swung it in slow, deliberate arcs. "You're not walking out of here without a few bruises, old man," he spat, his knuckles whitening as he tightened his grip on the chain. Clint didn't respond. He merely shifted his stance, raising his hands in a defensive position, his eyes locked onto the biker with a quiet intensity. With a snap of his wrist, the biker swung the chain, aiming for Clint's torso. Clint sidestepped effortlessly, moving with the kind of precision that only came with years of training. Before the biker could recover, Clint closed the gap between them in a flash, seizing the chain mid-swing and yanking it from his grasp in one smooth motion. Without hesitation, Clint twisted the chain around the biker's wrist, using the momentum to pull him forward. The biker lurched helplessly, crashing face first into the counter with a sickening thud. He collapsed onto the floor, dazed and defeated. Outside, Duke paced beside his motorcycle, his bloodied face contorted with fury. He could barely process what was happening. The sounds from inside, the grunts of pain, the crashing of furniture, the cheers of onlookers, made his blood boil. His gang, the Iron Serpents, were feared around here. They weren't supposed to lose. Not like this. With a guttural growl, Duke yanked a crowbar from his bike and stormed back into the diner. His rage burned hotter with every step, his grip tightening around the cold steel. "You think you've won?" he bellowed, his voice filling the room as he brandished the crowbar. "I'll show you what happens when you mess with me." Clint turned to face him, his expression as calm as ever. He adjusted his jacket, took a slow step forward. The soft creak of his boots was the only sound in the now silent diner. "This is your last chance to walk away," Clint said evenly. "Don't make me hurt you any more than I already have." Duke let out a furious snarl and charged, swinging the crowbar with reckless fury. Clint moved like water. The first swing whistled past him, then the second. With each wild strike, Duke's frustration mounted. On the third attempt, Clint struck. With lightning speed, he caught Duke's wrist mid-arc, twisting it sharply. Duke let out a strangled cry, his fingers spasming as the crowbar slipped from his grasp, clattering loudly onto the floor. In the same breath, Clint sent the crowbar skidding across the diner with a quick kick, putting it well out of reach. Then, with a firm shove to Duke's chest, Clint sent him stumbling backward. He crashed into a booth, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his arm cradled against his body in pain. The fight was over. The onlookers erupted into applause, their cheers ringing through the diner. The tension that had gripped the room like a vice finally shattered, replaced with an almost celebratory energy. Betty, stepping out from behind the counter, let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her eyes flickered with gratitude and relief as she looked at Clint. He simply adjusted his hat and turned toward the door, his steps measured, deliberate. "Next time," he said over his shoulder, his voice calm but carrying a quiet warning, "think twice before picking a fight you can't finish." And with that, Clint walked out, leaving behind a diner full of awestruck patrons and a gang of battered, humiliated bikers who would never forget the lesson they had just learned. Outside, the sun hung low in the Texas sky, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The remaining members of the Iron Serpents slumped beside their motorcycles, nursing their injuries in sullen silence. Duke leaned against his bike, his face swollen and bloodied, his eyes locked onto the diner door as if expecting Clint to walk back out at any moment. But Clint was gone. Duke's pride stung worse than any of his bruises. For the first time in years he had been humiliated, and he didn't know how to handle it. Inside, the tension had begun to dissolve. Patrons helped straighten overturned chairs, sweeping up shattered glass and righting tables. Betty, still shaken, poured herself a strong cup of coffee before stepping out from behind the counter. "I don't know who that man was," she muttered, shaking her head, "but he sure knew how to handle himself." A burly trucker sitting at the counter took a slow sip of his coffee, nodding in agreement. "He moved like one of those martial arts guys in the movies," he mused. Admiration in his voice. "Didn't even break a sweat." Around the diner, people murmured their agreement, replaying the fight in their minds as if it had been a scene from an action film. The air had shifted from fear to reverence for the mysterious stranger who had walked in and changed everything. Meanwhile, Duke was still pacing outside, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust. "We can't just let this slide," he growled, his voice thick with frustration. One of his men, still cradling his ribs, shot him a wary look. "What do you want to do, Duke? Go back in there and get knocked out again? That guy isn't normal." Duke spun on him, his face red with rage. "We can't let some old man make fools out of us. You know what people are going to say when they hear about this? We're the Iron Serpents, damn it. Nobody makes us look weak." But even as he shouted, doubt crept into his voice. Deep down, he knew Clint was different. The youngest member of the gang, a wiry guy named Jesse, finally spoke up. "Maybe we shouldn't mess with him anymore, Duke. I mean, look at what he did to us. You think he's just some retired vet or something?" Jesse's words struck a nerve. What kind of man could take on 5 bikers and walk away without a scratch? Duke's glare softened for just a moment before he clenched his jaw. "Whatever he is," he muttered, "he's not getting away with this." Inside the diner, Betty stepped outside, taking a deep breath as she leaned against the doorframe. The sun had begun to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw him. Clint was walking along the highway, his silhouette framed by the setting sun. Without hesitation, Betty grabbed a to-go cup of coffee and jogged toward him. "Hey," she called out. Clint slowed his pace, turning to face her. She held out the coffee. "Thought you might need this," she said with a small smile. "After all, you didn't get to finish yours." Clint took the cup with a nod. "Appreciated," he said, taking a slow sip. Betty hesitated, searching for the right words. I don't mean to pry," she finally said, "but who are you? You're not just some retiree passing through, are you?" Clint studied her for a moment. Then, in a voice quiet but firm, he answered, "Just a man who knows trouble when he sees it." Betty watched as he turned and continued walking, his shadow stretching long across the road. She had a feeling this wasn't the last time she'd hear his name. "You better not be lying, Betty," Duke sneered, his swollen face twisting in anger. "That old man's got a debt to settle, and I'm coming to collect." Betty didn't flinch. She crossed her arms, meeting Duke's glare with unwavering resolve. "Leave, Duke," she said firmly. "You've already done enough damage for one day." For a moment, Duke stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, with a bitter chuckle, he shook his head. "Fine," he muttered, stepping back toward his motorcycle. But as he swung a leg over the seat, he turned back one last time. "This ain't over." The roar of engines filled the night as Duke and his gang sped off into the darkness, their taillights vanishing down the highway. Betty exhaled, feeling a strange mix of relief and unease settle in her chest. She had no idea where Clint had gone, but she silently hoped he was ready for whatever came next. And somewhere down that long, empty stretch of road, Clint was preparing. He sat in the dimly lit motel room, the hum of the ceiling fan the only sound breaking the silence. His leather notebook lay open on the desk before him, its pages illuminated by the soft glow of the bedside lamp. Slowly he flipped through the old photographs and handwritten notes, each one a fragment of a past that had shaped him into the man he was today. His gaze lingered on a black-and-white photograph tucked between the pages. A younger version of himself stared back, dressed in a crisp karate uniform, his stance poised, his expression fierce with determination. It was the day he had earned his black belt, a moment seared into his memory. He had trained for years, enduring grueling sessions, bruises, failures, and victories, all leading up to that single achievement. But it wasn't just about the belt. It was about what he had learned. Growing up in the rougher parts of Los Angeles, Clint had seen firsthand the kind of men who preyed on the weak, men like Duke, who mistook intimidation for true strength. He had made a vow early on never to be a victim, a promise that led him to a small karate dojo hidden between a laundromat and a deli. The dojo's master, Sensei Matsuda, had seen something in the scrawny, determined teenager who showed up day after day, eager to learn. But Matsuda's lessons weren't just about fighting, they were about discipline, about knowing when to act and when to walk away. Strength isn't about who hits the hardest, Matsuda had once told him after a particularly intense sparring session. It's about knowing when not to hit. A true warrior fights only when there is no other choice. Those words had stayed with Clint through every battle, every conflict, every crossroads in his life. They had carried him through his years in the military, where his combat skills had been tested in ways he never could have imagined. And later, as a civilian, they had become a guiding principle, a reminder that violence was not the answer, but sometimes it was the only language some men understood. Now, as he sat in the stillness of the motel room, Clint knew what was coming. The iron serpents wouldn't let this go. Men like Duke never did. So he prepared. He practiced his breathing, steadying his mind. He stretched, rolling out the stiffness in his muscles, fine-tuning the movements he had perfected over decades of training. Every breath, every movement was deliberate, controlled, focused. Meanwhile, back at the Iron Serpent's garage, Duke and his gang were gearing up for their revenge. Weapons were loaded into saddlebags, chains, bats, knives, anything they could use to tip the odds in their favor. Duke's face was a mask of fury, the swelling around his nose doing nothing to dim the fire in his eyes. "We're not holding back this time," he growled. "I don't care how tough that old man thinks he is. We're going to show him what happens when you mess with the Iron Serpents." But not all of his men shared his confidence. Jesse, the youngest member of the gang, lingered near the back, his brow furrowed with unease. "Duke," he said hesitantly, "what if he's ex-military or something? That guy wasn't just some random old man. He knew what he was doing." Duke shot him a withering glare. "I don't care if he's Rambo himself," he snapped. "He's not invincible. He got lucky, that's all. And tonight we're going to put him in his place." The gang roared their engines, their motorcycles rumbling to life. Jesse hesitated for just a second longer, but in the end he climbed onto his bike, knowing there was no point in arguing. Back at the motel, Clint stood by the window, staring out into the darkness. The distant growl of engines carried through the night air, confirming what he already knew. They were coming. He exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. He had faced men like Duke before, and he knew exactly how to deal with them. Slipping on his jacket, Clint stepped out into the cool night air. The stars burned bright overhead, illuminating the vast Texas plains. He wasn't looking for a fight, but if they brought one to him, he would end it. For good. The rumble of motorcycles grew louder, slicing through the stillness. One by one, the Iron Serpents pulled into the gravel parking lot, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Duke was the first to dismount, his bruised and battered face twisting in rage. Behind him, his gang followed, bolstered by a few extra members who hadn't been at the diner earlier. They were armed? Clint simply leaned against a wooden post, his hands resting loosely at his sides. "Evening, boys," he greeted, his voice calm but edged with something sharper. Duke stepped forward, boots crunching on the gravel. "Cut the crap, old man. You humiliated us back there, and now it's time to pay." Clint tilted his head slightly, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "That right," he mused. "And you think bringing a few extra friends is going to change how this ends?" Duke's grip tightened around the crowbar in his hand. "Oh, it's going to end all right. And this time, you're not walking away." The gang spread out, forming a loose circle around Clint. Their movements were cautious. They had underestimated him once, and they weren't about to make the same mistake again. But fear lingered in their eyes. They had seen what he was capable of. Clint pushed off the post, straightening his stance. "You've got one last chance to walk away," he said. "You don't want to do this." Duke let out a bitter laugh. "You don't get to call the shots here, old man." He turned to his men. "Take him down." The first biker charged. Clint moved, and in a blur of motion the fight began. As the dust settled and the final blow was struck, the iron serpents lay scattered in the dirt, groaning, beaten, defeated. Clint stood tall, untouched, his breathing steady. Duke, clutching his bruised ribs, spat a mouthful of blood onto the gravel. "You think this is over?" he rasped. "You think you've won?" Clint stepped closer, his gaze like steel. "It's over when you decide it is," he said. "Walk away, learn something, or come back and lose again." For a long moment, Duke just stared. Then finally he turned to his men. "Let's go." One by one, the bikers mounted their motorcycles and rode off into the night. Clint watched them disappear. And then, without a word, he turned back toward the motel, stepping into the glow of the flickering neon sign. The lesson had been taught. Whether they learned from it was up to them.